Hello and welcome to On the Record, I'm Mark Dreyer. In this episode we sit down with Jonathan Watts, an environmental reporter from the Guardian newspaper in the UK. He's just finished a 9-year stint in China and is leaving to take up his next post in another fast-growing emerging market, Brazil. In this interview he talks about the Chinese government's attitude towards green issues, how environmental conflicts are becoming increasingly common, especially in areas of ethnic diversity, and how the West bears at least some responsibility for China's present-day carbon emissions. In the 9 years that Watts has been in China, coal consumption has more than doubled, incomes have tripled, GDP has quadrupled, and car ownership has risen fivefold. But that extraordinary economic output and growth has meant a massive rise in harmful emissions. China has recognised the need to lessen its dependence on fossil fuels, with huge investments made in the renewable energy sector, as part of a plan to supply 15% of the country's energy from alternative and renewable sources by 2020. With round after round of global climate talks seemingly making little progress on a new binding agreement on emissions, the need to address pressing environmental issues grows before the costs, economic or otherwise, become too great. Now, Jonathan, you came to China about 9 years ago, first of all as a regular reporter, but then you transitioned into more environmental reporting. How did that come about?
It was not deliberate. I was previously in Japan and I was covering general news, technology, politics, finance, business, and I planned to do the same in China, and I did, but I found myself writing more and more stories about the environment, pollution, climate change, drought, waste, and the story kind of rose up rather than being chosen. Over time, I came to realize that it was behind so many other things. It was one of the reasons why there were protests in the countryside. It's one of the reasons, one of the most likely areas in which economic growth is likely to falter because of, say, water issues. And so I began to specialize increasingly, and in 2008 became a full-time environmental specialist.
How do you think the Chinese leadership has addressed, in particular, environmental issues?
In one sense, they've been much more dynamic and proactive than they have in other areas. So, for example, I arrived in 2003, pretty much the same year that Wen Jiabao and Hu Jintao took power. But if you look at the period since then, when it comes to political reform, there's been nothing, almost nothing. But when you look at what they've done to try and deal with environmental problems, there's been a lot of activity. There's been China's first carbon intensity target. There's been efforts to improve environmental transparency. There's been tighter controls on pollution, at least on paper. And there's been an enormous investment in renewable energy. And so I think these haven't been enough to deal with what is, I think, the world's worst environmental crisis. But they show an understanding of the problems and quite a strong degree of political will to do something about them.
You talked about people really want the desire to clean up and to change. We've seen that a little bit over the last year or so, particularly in terms of air pollution. The US Embassy releasing real-time data on its monitoring feed. And it seems that the public have really kind of got behind this to try and push for change. Do you expect to see more of this?
I do, yes. I think that we're at the stage of development in China where countries that were at a similar stage saw a great deal more a great deal of activity in the environmental field, lots of protests, a great deal more understanding and awareness of the problems, and with a middle class rising up that really wants to ensure that their house prices are worth more. So they don't want to be near a dirty chemical factory, and they're worried about their children much more, and so they don't want them living near polluted streams and so on. So I think you'll see a stronger NIMBY movement in China, not in my backyard movement, that we've already seen signs of, for example, of the protests in Dalian and in Xiamen over the PX factories. There are protests over incinerators. So there's all of that going on in the sort of the more developed cities, and at the same time, there is a big problem going on in the countryside that's not so well covered, which is that a lot of the really dirty, really dangerous factories tend to be in small, out-of-the-way places. And I think that's an area where actually there needs to be an effort to go there, because those people do not have an awful lot of economic or political power.
Now, from a global perspective, one of the repeated stumbling blocks seems to be that the West says, well, China, you're polluting, you're putting all this bad stuff into the atmosphere. China says, well, you did it first. And it's this sort of back and forth that no one can really get past. What can be done about it? How can they get past it?
Through negotiation. It's the only way through negotiation, greater understanding, some give and take. China and other developing countries do have a strong historical argument to say that, you know, we are the way we are as dirty as we are, to a large extent because we're following the model that you set 50, 100 years ago. And also because one of the reasons you have been able to clean up in Europe and the US is by outsourcing dirty, energy-intensive industries to China and other developing countries. But that only goes so far. I mean, China is also producing for itself. Chinese communities are the ones that are suffering here, and you know, there are other countries that are developing and don't seem to have had quite the same degree of environmental stress as China's had. So, yes, valid argument, definitely an important part of the debate, but I think everybody realizes ultimately that if you just get locked into that, we're all going to suffer.